Hello, Kevin. Oh,
Hello, how are you today? Can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you.
Great, thank you so much. Uh,
And you should have access to be able to put your PowerPoint up there as well.
yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I have my slideshow ready to go.
Perfect.
I'm gonna try to get fancier here. I'm gonna try to fix my display settings here for a second, so I apologize if it goes a little,
Nope, you're good.
if it goes a little crazy. Okay. How's everything today?
It's going good. It's a little rainy here, so I'm still waiting for summer.
I hear that. Great. Pretty good. He's running here. Here's good. Okay. Right, I am ready to go. I'm actually gonna move this here. Okay.
We'll just
I got relocated, so I apologize.
Oh, no, you're good. I know I got a an old computer because mine died on me. And so it's like I can't do all the stuff I used to do.
Yeah. Okay, can you see my slideshow? Yeah.
I can. Yes.
Great, great,
Perfect.
great, excellent.
And then we will just give it about 2 more minutes.
No problem, no problem.
All right, so we will begin. This meeting is being recorded. This is the last of our small credit union webinar series. And today we have Kevin Doyle, who is from Employer Association of Northeast, and he's going to talk about the top 5 mistakes in human resources. So Kevin brings a wealth of experience in operations and HR across retail, manufacturing, and staffing industries, having worked in both solo and corporate HR roles with expertise in recruiting, training, employee relation, safety, payroll, and benefit administration. Kevin joined the Employers Association of Northeast as an HR business partner in 2023, later transitioning to the role of member service HR coordinator. In this capacity, Kevin collaborates with various teams to deliver tailored information, services, and training programs to meet members' evolving needs. Kevin superheads HR projects, offers hotline support, conducts training programs, and develops new content and resources to enhance member experiences. Kevin's senior professional HR certification further underscores his proficiency in the field, which complements his bachelor degree in human resource management from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. So today during our meeting, if you have any questions, feel free to either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. So Kevin, if you want to take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. Yeah, so thank you. So again, my name is Kevin Jolie. I'm with the Employers Association. Really excited to be here and talk with you all about some common HR mistakes that happens throughout all industries and all types, right? And things that we've all, maybe done before without realizing it, or maybe we're misinformed on, right? So more than happy to be here and share it. So screen is good, right? Audio is good. Please let me know if
Yep,
it's
it's
not.
perfect.
Thank you, thank you. So yeah, so let's get started. So I kind of went through all that, right? So today we're going to talk about our top 5 HR mistakes. We're going to talk about why they are a concern, right? And that's usually fines and penalties, right? Are the reasons they're big concerns. We're going to talk about some ways to avoid these mistakes. And then feel free to drop in questions at any time throughout the meeting, or we can save them for the end. So we can get started. So the first mistake, and it's very timely right now, given the recent Department of Labor releases, right? One of our biggest mistakes is we are misclassifying our workers, right? So there's hourly and salary, right? And then there's exempt and non-exempt. And by exempt, we mean exempt from overtime per the guidelines of the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? So we think because people are salaried sometimes that they don't have they're exempt from overtime, but based on their job duties and the type of work they do, they may not be actually to be able exempt from overtime. So we should be paying them, right? So one of the most common things we see in that is we have office staff, right? Administrative assistants or administrative workers, right? And we give them a salary. And we just think, oh, because they're salaried, we don't have to pay them overtime, right? Because it's easier for payroll or it's easier for X, Y, and Z. When actually, depending on what they're doing and the job duties they're doing, they might not be eligible to meet that exemption because of the type of work, the amount of control they have, or their job duties. So this is one of the biggest issues we see. So employers need to be aware that if you have an office person, I think about an administrative assistant or a warehouse shipping assistant, right? That's not doing a lot of self-directed work, or they don't have a lot of authority or control. It's very possible that they're not supposed to be salaried exempt and should be getting paid overtime for any hours worked over 40. So the other thing that we fall into all the time is we sometimes have salaried workers and we're treating them like hourly, right? So they're salaried exempt as we have them classified, but they miss a day or they call out or for some reason, and then we deduct their pay because they're not working their hours, right? That could definitely be a violation of their salaried exempt because you're treating them like an hourly employee instead of a salaried employee. So, well, I think what's really important is just because someone's salaried doesn't mean they're automatically exempt from overtime. It really comes down to the types of exemptions, right? So for anyone that's familiar with it, there's all sorts of types of exemptions you can do. There's administrative, there's executive, there's professional. So if you go on the Fair Labor Standards or the DOL's website and you look at these exemptions, they'll further explain what it takes to be in these exemptions. And there's a salary threshold as well as a jobs duty test, right? So that's definitely one of the bigger issues we see. And on the same lines of that, we have a lot of organizations that, and we've, organizations as a whole, classify people as contractors, right? When they're really not supposed to be. So that 1099. And where it's really a point of concern is when that contractor is doing similar work that your organization already does, right? So this is a human resources company. We hire Kevin as a 1099 contractor to do HR work. But the HR work is what our business is, right? So there's an argument that Kevin really shouldn't be a 1099 because he's doing the work of your company, right? A more clean example, right? When we think about we're going to hire an HVAC contractor to come in here and fix our HVAC system, right? And let's just say we're a restaurant, right? That HVAC person isn't doing the work that we do. He doesn't cook food, he doesn't make food, doesn't serve food, right? So in that instance, he can really be a contractor, right? Because he's doing a separate job. He owns his own business. There's all these other things that would make him really truly be a 1099 contractor and not one of your employees, right? So this is another thing we're starting to see, especially with this gig economy and all these people kind of freelancing. If we are improperly making someone a contractor, we may be running the risk of violating some rules here, right? And the other thing you're going to hear a lot is people want to be contractors. They're okay with it. They like the flexibility. Just because they want to be doesn't mean they actually can, right? Because the other issue is we're not giving them benefits, we're not giving them proper benefit entitlements. So there's some definite concerns there. So when we talk about why this is a big concern, right? Back pay, fines, all sorts of attorney fees. This is usually the source of a class action lawsuit, right? So if you have one person misclassified, say it's a bigger company, maybe everybody in that group is now misclassified, right? So now there's some argument that there's a bigger group of people that were affected by this, right? This is definitely a huge focus, and we're going to talk in a little bit that there's been an update to this DOL and the threshold. So it's definitely something that's on the authorities' radar, right? And then those who are classified as independent contractors wrongly, we could be held liable for not providing proper benefits. It could provide additional penalties, right? And then we could get additional tax penalties under the IRS for not properly classifying our workers appropriately. So it's definitely a huge concern. Where it could really fall apart is a relationship goes sour with an employee. They blow the whistle, and say that they were improperly paid. Now you have an audit and now you have to justify all these things, right? Or the other issue is someone gets a word that they should have been eligible for overtime all this time. And they've been working all these hours and we haven't been paying it. They get upset and they call the Department of Labor. They come in here. Now we have to sit here and justify and explain why we think our employees should be salaried exempt. So it's definitely an area to focus on. So how do we avoid this trap, right? We really, really recommend doing an internal audit, looking at those job duty tests, looking at your salaries, making sure that we feel comfortable that they meet the duties test, right? And it's a very gray area and there's not a clear-cut answer. But using the job duties test and talking with a professional about the situation can definitely help you get a good understanding of where you sit in terms of properly classifying your workers, right? And that also goes back to your job descriptions. The other thing that's really important is just because we have a job description out there, let's say Kevin's the director of human resources, but all he's really doing is entering data into a human resources system. If I get interviewed and they ask me what I do all day and that's what I tell them, they're going to say, Kevin, you really shouldn't be salaried exempt because you're not meeting the duties test, right? So your job description is important, but it really comes down to what they actually do all day and the level of control, judgment, relationship to the operations that it really has. So it's really important that we look back and dig into some of those areas. And that administrative area is definitely always a huge area. The other thing is your first line supervisors, right? If they're a working supervisor and they're on the floor doing the work primarily, there's an argument that they maybe can't be salaried exempt because the primary duty isn't managing or directing, it's actually performing the work of your organization. So just another thing to be aware of. And then on the same token as your independent contractors, when you look at that relationship, right, there's additionally a test for contractors as well, right? And it has to do with the control, the possibility of income, right? The longevity of the relationship, how the work relates to your business, right? There's all these factors they consider to see if this person can truly be an independent contractor. So as we're looking through those, if we identify that maybe someone shouldn't be an independent contractor, you might want to have some conversations with the powers that be on how we want to fix this situation and how to do it tactfully, right? Because the other thing that's going to happen, let's say we've misclassified somebody for years, and now we're going to them and we're going to tell them, hey, by the way, you've been classified wrong. We're changing this and now you're eligible for overtime. Is that going to click in their head that, oh, well, have I been getting paid wrong for a long time? And if so, how much money am I owed? Right. So that conversation needs to be done tactfully with this updated DOL increasing the salary threshold, this might be a great opportunity to kind of segue into it and say, hey, based on the recent rulings and some of these things, we're going to make these changes. But this is definitely an area we want to focus on. So just as we were talking, this is a new slide. There are some updates. Anyone that's been listening to HR compliance or compliance news, it's probably everywhere, right? They are raising the administrative thresholds, or excuse me, the executive administrative and professional salary level thresholds. So 684 is the current. It's actually moving to 844, and then on July 1st, it's going to be 1128. Right. And then that second thing is for your highly compensated people. Right. So barring some sort of crazy change or appeal or this thing getting pulled, this is a very real possibility. These things are happening and are going to happen effective July 1. So if you're looking at your salaries and you're looking at your exemptions, this is a great time to do it because there's going to be potentially some serious changes coming very soon. So we've got to get everyone lined up with that. Questions about that?
I don't see anything in the chat. That's very interesting information.
Yes, it's definitely on a lot of people's radars, right?
Yep.
And I think about credit unions and banking, and I think about lead tellers, head tellers, people that are performing the bulk of the duty. Those might be potentially, right, hotspot areas where we want to look at if this person should really be salaried exempt. Now, the other thing I will say is it's never against the rules to pay someone hourly, right? So if we wanted to if someone's salary and we're not 100% comfortable with them being salaried exempt, you could make them hourly, right? Just if you're not sure. But yeah, it's definitely a good opportunity to look at these things and maybe make some changes while this is fresh in everyone's mind.
And 2025 will be right around the corner.
Yes. Yeah, I know. We're already halfway through this year. It feels like it just started, right? It's May-ish,
Exactly.
right? So crazy. Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's definitely flying. And I don't think anyone's dying to look at everyone's job titles and update their salaries, right? So it's going to come quicker. The things we don't want are going to move a lot quicker towards us than the things that we're waiting for, right?
Exactly.
So just an FYI on that. Right. So the other one that we get all the time, right, is the failure to pay employees properly or timely, right? And this is for a variety of reasons, right? We think about hours worked, right? So, and I don't know how much this happens maybe in the credit union banking world, but I'll use manufacturing. We have a great employee, starts at 7, but they like to come in a half hour early, turn on the machines, get everything fired up because they just want to be ready, right? And the owners or the president or the managers might think, well, he wants to do it, so it's no harm, no foul. He's just a great employee that likes to get a head start. That's technically a wage and hour violation if we're not paying them for that because he or she or they are being suffered or permitted to work, right? So, and they may be okay with it, but if they ever filed a complaint and could prove that they've been working all this extra time without getting paid for it, we're going to have ourselves a wage and hour violation. So I think about maybe, I worked retail for many years, right? I think about our hourly people. We had an overtime crunch. We didn't want them to hit overtime. So some supervisors or hourly people would take it upon themselves to clock out and go back to work to finish the night because they didn't want to get hit for overtime. And that's a wage and hour violation, right? Because they need to get paid regardless of whether they want to or not.
So Kevin, I have a question. I always think of tellers in this situation. So I always used to say the tellers have to be up and running by 8 o'clock. And so in order to get their drawer and everything out, I mean, they would have to come in 10, 15 minutes early. So they should be paid for those 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah, I think depending on the amount of work they're doing, right? If they're pulling out a drawer, counting the money, opening up, I mean, there's an argument that that's more than a de minimis task, right? If they're just signing onto their computer real quick, maybe not. But if they have to get a cash drawer, count the money, open up, maybe unlock doors. I mean, there's definitely an argument that it might be, depending on the time that they're at the time it takes for them to do it, right? So I think if it's taken 10, 15 minutes, there's definitely an argument that that's time worked.
Gotcha. Thank you.
But it would depend, right? If it's a quick thing, maybe not, right? But it's a great question, right? You know, the other thing we get onto is we don't pay our salaried workers on a salaried basis. It kind of goes back to our first thing, right? We pay them salary until they call out, and now we're cutting their salary because you know they called out a day, right? Depending on
Right.
the situation, that could be an issue, right?
True.
And then making improper deductions from salary or pay is another one, right? So you know, in some states, depending on what it is, if there's errors in your drawer, you can't make employees pay for those, right? And I think a lot of states have adopted that that's not an authorized deduction, right? The other thing that most states have is you can't drop them below minimum wage, right? So that's another concern to be aware of if we're taking deductions from employees. The other thing we want to be mindful of, if it's outside of health insurance or state taxes or federal taxes, any other deduction needs to be authorized, and even those should be authorized as well. But depending on what it is, it may not be a proper deduction, right? And why this is a huge concern is it can lead to wage payment issues. It can lead to loss of exempt status, which would entitle them back to overtime pay, right? So where this really goes sideways is we have an employee that's maybe upset or isn't happy, and then they leave, and then they file a wage and hour claim, right? And now we have them in here auditing us, and now they're looking at all of these things, right? So if someone gets a word that they're not maybe getting paid right, or there's some pay issues, it could put the organization in a really tough spot. So we want to make sure that we're airtight with what we're paying and how we're paying it. The other thing that we think about too is, you know, it's also has to do with pay corrections and pay deductions and payment at termination, right? So these all become wage and hour concerns, right? How often are we paying? Are we meeting the pay cycle frequency that we're supposed to per state law? Right? Are we paying people at termination properly? If we're voluntarily terminating them, right? So we want to fire somebody today, but we don't have their check ready. You know, is it going to be ready in the correct time frame for them, or are we just going to add it to next week's check and forget about it? That could be a wage payment timing issue if we voluntarily terminated them, right? And then the other thing, you know, if they've accumulated PTO, benefits, sick time, maybe not necessarily sick time, but vacation and holidays, and they've earned them, you know, are they due those things at termination, right? Or because of how they left, we don't want to pay them that, and they've otherwise earned them, right? So all of these could be paid wage payment issues if we're not following them correctly. And state by state, it does vary. How wage payments have to get paid out. So it's really, really important if you're multi-state that we look at what that payout looks like. Any questions about that topic? Thoughts?
I don't see anything in the chat.
Perfect. I must be answering everything ahead of time, right? So
That's
great.
right.
All
You're
right.
very thorough.
Great. Okay. Good. So the next one that we talk about and is failing to offer COBRA coverage properly, right? So federal COBRA is 20 or more, right? And then state specifically, a lot of states have mini COBRA. And Vermont has, I believe, something similar where there's like a mini COBRA version where they need to offer coverage, right? So what's important is that we're offering it to all the qualified beneficiaries. They're being allowed to enroll at the right times. We're giving them the detailed proper notices, right? And then if they do elect, we're keeping track of it, filing it right, giving them the 18 months or whatever time frame that they have, right? So a lot of considerations with this. What do they have to pay? When's the first payment due? Are all qualified beneficiaries have the right to elect, right? So I think about husband and wife, or husband and husband, wife and wife, they split up, they get divorced, one of them moves out, right? We send all the notices to the policy holder of the company, so the spouse, right? They don't elect it. The spouse is unaware that there's a COBRA event because they didn't get any mail because they're in a different person's house, right? And they never get an opportunity to elect COBRA, right? And that could be a concern if, and that might be a violation of their concern. So if we're not sure that participants are all living in the same address, we might want to send separate notices. The other thing that's really, really important is the timeframes of when we notify them. And how do we handle all those shortages? So again, why this is a big concern, it always comes down to taxes, fines, penalties, right? So the IRS can impose some serious penalties per day per individual. There can be some excise tax issues, right? There can be attorney's fees, right? And there could be some liability for uncovered medical expenses, right? So if I was find out that I wasn't offered COBRA and I accumulated all these medical bills, I could potentially go back to the company and say, hey, I was denied my rights under COBRA to elect this process. Now in actuality, COBRA is very expensive, right? And most employees don't elect it. But it is something to be aware of that they do have the option to do so. And depending on the size of your organization, maybe it's a third party or it's some sort of controlled process to help you capture all these COBRAs if you're in an industry or in a size where we have a lot of this happening. So, how do we fix this, or how do we avoid these traps, right? We want to make sure we use our COBRA practices. Who owns the COBRA process, right? Is it a third party? What triggers the COBRA process, right? If there's a termination, does that kick off a series of events that lets us know that we need to address COBRA concerns? Are we using the model notices provided by state and federal government? So usually your state entity has a COBRA notice that's very detailed, right? Are they going out on time? Are we notifying the carrier timely, right? And then the other thing that's really important, does the dates line up? Another example that we think of all the time is, hey, things went sideways with this employee. Kevin's fired today, but we're going to keep his coverage until the 30th, right? And then when we go to terminate him, we backdate his COBRA coverage to the date he actually left, right? And now we have some date issues, right? So let's say I went to the doctors or something happened in that time frame. Was I actually covered, or am I covered under COBRA? But let's say I don't want COBRA, because you told me that my coverage is going to go to the end of the month, right? So lining those dates up is super important, and they really need to be per the policy and in your plan document, right? So if employees terminate on the day of coverage, their insurance terminates, we want to make sure everything lines up and those dates line up, but also that we're providing notices at the proper time, right? The other big one too is when they enroll in health insurance, right? Are we giving them the model notices within 90 days, right? So I enroll in your health insurance plan or become eligible, I get the proper notices, right? And then in many cases, if we're not going to provide COBRA, do we let them know that, right? Because let's say down the road they never get it, they have 60 days go by, and then something bad happens to them, and now they need coverage, and you say, well, your 60 days lapsed or you're not eligible. They're going to kind of want to know, hey, well, I was never informed of that. I thought I had more time, and how do we prove that? So, any other questions about that? Any thoughts on that? To your point, I don't see the chat full, but if anyone has anything, please feel free to reach out.
Sounds good.
Awesome. So mistake number 4, and I think this all hits near and dear to our HR people, right? Are the I-9 violations, right? And there's so many ways for this to go sideways. And, I've been doing I-9s for 11 years, right? And you learn something every day about them, right? And they've changed them, and there's new guidance, and we've allowed a remote inspection, right? Because of COVID. And that was supposed to go away, but now they're still allowing it. So there's always a change. There's always updated forms. And because of our global economy and people working remotely and people working in other countries, I-9s have definitely gotten a lot more complicated, right? Because now there's all sorts of new documents, there's immigration, there's asylees, there's all these protected working classes now. I think about students on I-20s and all sorts of things like that, right? There's all these combinations where if you receive them, you're maybe not sure if they're authorized to work, right? So there may be a time where you need to consult an immigration person or an attorney about, are they providing the proper or correct documents? So there was a new form that released over the summer, right? That had to be started to use in the fall. It's listed here. It used to be 2 pages, maybe 3-ish, right? Now it's down to 1. The re-verification's on a separate page. So one of the big things we get is people are using the wrong form. We have an onboarding packet that we've had for years, So we always use it. We have 100 copies of it. It's switched and we've been using the old form, right? It's very possible that I-9 form is outdated. So we want to make sure we look at those and check the dates. The dates are usually up here, top right, is when it expires. And then you'll see the form variation down at the bottom left, right? So making sure we're using the right form is super important. Usually we get the wrong documentation or we're over documenting. This is another big one, right? So we take their passport, their license, and their social. That's way too many documents, right? Or we take their license and their passport and not a list C, right? So we want to make sure we're taking adequate documentation, but not over documenting, right? The other thing we see all the time is someone comes from another country, they have a foreign passport, or they have a permanent resident card, and then we're also asking for the social security card, right? So that could be a violation too. If they have an acceptable list A document that is unexpired and looks legitimate, we cannot ask for additional documentation, right? And then the other thing that we come up against all the time is we ask for specific documentation, right? And we can't require them to provide certain documents, right? They just have to provide adequate documentation to support that they can work per the I-9 guidelines. So if your company has some sort of policy of we only accept licenses and socials, that's definitely not acceptable, right? The other mistakes we come in all the time is we fail to fill in the right spaces, right? Or we leave things blank, we don't sign them. The other thing that happens all the time is we don't finish them, right? So we get all the paperwork, we onboard them in 3 days, and then we never get back to actually filling out their documents and the pages and signing them correctly. Technically, that's a violation, and we should have signed it within 3 days. And then the other thing that we come through, we take over a department or we go back and audit it, and then we don't properly correct the I-9s and update them correctly in the event that we ever receive an audit. So why is this a big concern? All sorts of violations, right? And this is a little bit small, but these are all the different sizes of violations and they can grow, right? So once we become aware of fines and penalties, or once we become aware of violations, we are now on notice, right? So we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to fix those issues, right? Because if we get caught again, that's going to exponentially increase the fines here, right? And then if you're a federal contractor or doing government work, you could potentially lose contracts for not following your immigration policies, right? Because or by immigration, I mean your I-9 e-verification, U.S. Immigration policies here. So if you're an e-verifier, there's a whole bunch of other different rules about the documentation and how to keep it. And there's all these best practices to make sure you have proper file and storage of your info. But big penalties, where this happens too is if there's word on the street that you're maybe not hiring certain people or you're allowing people to come to work without proper documentation, right? And they start letting their friends know. And then you start allowing people as references to come to work and they don't have the proper documentation, that could be a serious violation. So it's something to be aware of. I've seen certain industries where they have a great source of workers, but they don't necessarily have the right documentation to be allowed to work yet. But the company takes them on anyways, and now the I-9s are incorrect, right? Or not existent, right? And that's a huge concern. So definitely want something to be aware of. So how do we fix these, right? We want to make sure we look at our USCIS resources. A lot of companies like my own offer audits for your I-9s. But you want to make sure you're looking at the correction and audit practices. I think a great place to start is you pull all your employee roster and your terminated employees from the last 5 years, and you at least make sure they each have an I-9, right? So that's a great start. So if they don't have an I-9 and they currently work for you, we need to get them one, right? Our terminated people, I don't know how much we can do about that, but at least get a base to make sure we have them all, right? And then we want to make sure it's the right version. We want to make sure that we've retained them properly, right? So the best practices within 3 years, right? For those that are terminated, right? And there's a longer equation, but you want to make sure you're saving those properly. are there only technical violations, right? So when we're correcting them, there's technical violations and then there's substantial violations, right? Substantive violations, right? And depending on which type of violation it is, that allows you to either draw a line through it and correct it, or you have to create a whole new document, right? So knowing what those are and knowing how to look for those might be helpful, because if we're just putting lines through substantive violations, it really called for a whole new document. So those are important things to be aware of when we're auditing our I-9s. And then there's also kind of a memo process where we can put some more information in the back to help correct that. So we recommend auditing your I-9s yearly at least. If you're in a high turnover organization where people are hiring and firing, you might want to audit them more frequently, right? Because your I-9s are going to change with more frequency. So definitely a huge concern and something to be aware of, especially as we move globally and start hiring remotely. Questions about that?
Nope. So you're just saying that they should be auditing all the people that have been terminated just to make sure that no violations.
Well, yeah, I mean, because they can look back, right? Because you're supposed to retain them properly, right, within that certain time frame. So, I mean, 10 years back, they're gone, right? If they don't work for you anymore, those really aren't a concern. But yeah, those recently terminated last 3 years, any current employees are definitely important. I think it's a good start to make sure everyone has one and that they're filled out, right? And you can look at the examples to see how to fill it out properly. Now, when you start digging into it more and, oh, we never filled out their license, or we never filled out this, or they never signed it. Now we're going to start getting into questions about how do we fix that, right? And depending on the situation, it's very possible we can correct it certain ways, or it might require just starting a whole new I-9 and having them refill it out. So, I think it's definitely a more complicated process than, oh, I can write it in, right? If it's page 1 or the employees section, we really don't want to start filling in employees' information, right, that they're supposed to be authorizing. So it gets a little bit dicey. And I'm more than happy to connect with somebody afterwards and talk through some more of the details. But there's some great resources on the I-9 USCIS website on how to fix these things.
Perfect. Thank you.
No, great questions. Any other thoughts or questions on that? Okay, great. All right. So our fifth mistake, and it's definitely a more broad one, but it hits at all forms and as a HR person and a person that does the hotline and talks to members and has worked in HR, lack of documentation takes so many forms, but it's really it's definitely a huge concern in so many ways, right? I think about all these protected leaves that happen now, right? So we have mass paid family, CT family leave, we have FMLA, we have sick time. There's all these protections, right? And holding people accountable is becoming a lot harder, right? And where people definitely fall apart with trying to hold people accountable is we don't have anything documented, right? And that's usually one of the first questions we ask people, or I've asked my supervisors, hey, we want to terminate this person. Well, what do we have on paper, right? What's our documentation? What can we prove, right? Because when it comes down to going to court or an MCAT or a Rhode Island or whatever chair that's doing your harassment or discrimination claims or whatever, they're going to ask what you have on paper and what you can prove, right? So some of the few areas we see it is lack of policies, right? So people tell me they have a policy on something and that's what they're holding their people accountable to. Well, where's the policy? Oh, well, it's not written. Going to be hard to prove that policy exists without it written down, right? And if people haven't acknowledged anything, right? I think about a handbook or some sort of training that acknowledges the policy. It may be difficult to prove that this policy exists, even if we enforce it regularly. The other one we see all the time is performance reviews. This is an area where we maybe either don't do reviews, right? Or everyone gets a 3 every year, everyone's okay, or everyone gets a great review, right? And then all of a sudden it's we want to get rid of this person, but 2 months ago they just got a performance review that gave them all 5s, right? So now the question becomes is what's happened in 2 months? Oh, well, we didn't really take the performance review serious. Everyone kind of gets the same thing. that's probably done more damage to you than it did to have one at all, right? So your performance reviews or talent management, whether it's quarterly check-ins, if someone's getting a bad performance review and then they're getting written up, it kind of all lines up with, hey, this performance is a concern. I'm pointing back to the performance review, and since then we haven't seen the necessary improvement. So really, really important that we have that document trail for unemployment, discrimination, harassment. All of it can become really, really important when we're trying to defend ourselves. Lack of corrective actions or investigative documentation. This is the other one that we hear all the time. So an employee's on a protected leave, or they're on this or that, and all of a sudden they're this terrible employee, and we want to get rid of them because they're doing a terrible job. And we're like, well, where's your paperwork? Oh, well, we've talked to them verbally, and they should be aware of it. We can't prove it, right? And if they are on a protected leave or they're in a protected class, and they're going to say, well, I was never written up, or I was never formally written up, we can't prove that we had those conversations, right? So now we're kind of handcuffed that we can't take any action against these employees because we don't have a great paper trail, right? And if they want to say they're being discriminated against, or being discriminated because they went on a protected leave, for example, and this is more so, we hear this a lot in Mass and Connecticut, we can't prove they're a poor employee because we don't have any documentation, right? So even if the employee is doing a poor job or a subpar job, we have no document or evidence that supports that they're in some sort of corrective action process, right? So definitely key areas, investigations, right? So we have a harassment complaint. And we handle it, right? We deal with the employee, we do all the right things, but we don't write down the investigation, we don't write down the documentation. We kind of close it out, and then 6 months from now we get a complaint, and we say that we did all of those things, but we just can't prove anything, right? And that's a concern when it comes to these local and federal agencies. They're going to look for some proof that we did the things we're supposed to do, because the details become important. So why is this a big concern, right? Failing to justify actions, right? It's hard to prove that you did things if we don't have it written down, right? It could lead to discrimination or improper treatment, right? It could be exposed non-compliance with other things, right? So if we're not following policies clearly, or we're not documenting policies clearly, there may be questions whether they exist, right? One of the examples that we get all the time is if our PTO policy isn't airtight and it's not documented well, how do we prove to our employees who are leaving or terminated that we don't owe them things, or they haven't earned time off, or they haven't earned certain things, right? So those are all important considerations. When we're documenting, it's all about what we can prove when we're talking. So how do we avoid this trap, right? Definitely want to have a comprehensive look at our policies and practices. Again, I wouldn't put a policy in your handbook that we're not going to follow 100%, right? Or I wouldn't put it in such a way where we're handcuffed to doing it a certain way, right? And if you ever needed help or assistance with drafting policies to meet those goals, that's definitely something we can handle. But if we have something in writing, we want to make sure we're following it, right? Can we show that they're provided to the employees, right? Do they sign the handbook acknowledgement? Do they re-sign it yearly? If we have a new policy, do we have them sign that? I think about our sexual harassment policy, right? How do we prove that we did training with our employees, right? They usually sign some sort of agreement, or they sign some sort of acknowledgement that they've received the policy and have received the training, right? We want to look at our personnel files, right? And what's in there. Is everything that's in there people are aware of? Are they citing them correctly in time, right? Do our reviews, are they documented correctly? Are they reflective of the employee's actual performance, right? And are they specific and clear? This is another area where our write-ups say Kevin's doing a bad job and he needs to get better, right? So that's what the write-up says. And I don't know if that's detailed enough to describe what the issue is. Kevin's missing money. Kevin's not serving customers correctly. Kevin's not entering the transactions correctly, right? Kevin's cost us $5,000 in errors in the last month, right? Kevin's got 4 customer complaints because he's rude to people, right? All of that is very measurable, detailed performance issues we should be documenting. And then when we talk about what Kevin needs to do to get better, right? What does that look like? We expect Kevin to have no errors over $10 in the next 3 months, right? Or we expect Kevin to go through customer service training and not have any customer complaints, right? So, or we expect Kevin to show up on time, X, Y, and Z, right? So having these detailed expectations are also really, really important. So when we get to the point where we feel like we want to terminate someone, we can prove that there was legitimate business concerns there where Kevin's performance or conduct affected the business. We gave him clear measurables to improve on, and on these dates, Kevin failed to do that, right? So based on that documentation, Kevin's truly getting fired for performance reasons and not for some other reason that might be considered discriminatory or harassing, right? So that documentation is so important, right? And then I think the other part that's really, really important is training our managers and our supervisors to be detailed with their documentation, right? So if they're going to write people up and HR is not going to review them, do we give them a template? Do we understand what a detailed write-up looks like? Do they, do they know what to not put on it, right? We don't put opinions, we don't put assumptions, right? We only put factual information that's detailed and work related, right? So training our supervisors to have great paper trails and documenting them professionally is really, really important. And also training our managers to be on the same page with policies and policy enforcement, so everyone has the perception that we're being a fair and equitable employer. So when it comes to documentation, it's super important. It's really where everything kind of falls apart. And then when it comes time to get defending ourselves in court or things like that, that's the first thing I'm gonna look for is all the documentation and proof that we did the things we said we did. So it's definitely a huge concern, and I'm more than happy to discuss some methods or ways to get a good documentation process going. Questions about that?
No, throughout the whole entire segment, I have learned it's so important to document because you need to have a good paper trail.
Yeah, and organized, right? Recallability.
Yep.
And again, I think having a process of how we do things, so everyone gets handled the same way, right? And then not trying to remember every little thing, right? So I think the other thing that we try to do sometimes is we try to keep it all in our head or do it on the fly, writing down policies, writing down procedures, creating checklists, right? Hey, Kevin was terminated. These are the 5 things that we need to do now, right? So never put it on yourself to remember everything. Having great processes and procedures, so you don't have to remember everything, I think becomes super important, because while you're doing all this, you still have a business to run, right? And we're not even talking about all the work you actually have to do. This is all the side things that become burdensome. Cool. So we usually leave it open for any questions, right? So any comments, questions, concerns for me?
If you'd like, you can either put them in the chat box or you can unmute and ask away.
Yeah, feel free. And even another question, I can't guarantee I'll answer. I can't guarantee I can give you the best answer for anything else, but I'm definitely open to other conversation as well.
Perfect. And this is the last of our small credit union webinar series, and everything has been recorded. And so if you want to go back and look at some of our recordings, then do so. I'm not seeing any questions here.
Okay. Yeah.
And if you do have a question and you want to get Kevin's phone number, feel free to reach out to Dean from CCUA or me from Vermont, and then we can make sure we get you to Kevin.
Yeah, and if the recording stops and we want to talk, I can more than happy to hang on and have conversation. So I can hang on for a few minutes. I'm definitely available to discuss anything.
Perfect. That's very neat.
Okay.
We're a quiet group today.
It's okay. Hey, it's okay, right? I appreciate everybody's time. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all. And I hope everyone has a great summer, and please feel free to reach out if you need me.
Well, thank you. And we appreciate you coming, and it was very informative. And again, I'm sure people will be reaching out to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.